Okay, hello, and welcome to another week here in Biogeography. This week we are getting into, I think, chapter 5 of the textbook. Again, the textbook is not required. We're just, if you happen to have it or are paying attention, that's kind of where we're at. But we're talking about the distribution of communities, biomes, and ecosystems this week. And I guess before I get into that, I want to mention really quickly I've gotten a few emails as we get into the semester asking about, how class is going to proceed, if we're going to meet for classes and things like that. I know a number of you are concerned about having in-person classes, and I am too. I think everyone kind of is, and this format seems to be working for everybody. So I'm just going to keep doing this. We're just going to keep doing these online modules, and we're not going to be meeting in person unless something dramatically changes. Um, so that's how we're going to proceed. And if anything's going to change, I'll be sure to let you guys know ahead of time. I know officially the class is still listed online as sort of hybrid or whatever they say. I'll look into getting that officially changed. I don't know if I can if I can get it changed online. But as far as as far as what we're actually doing, we're going to continue just with this online format. I think that's what makes the most sense for everybody. Okay, so getting into this module, this week we're talking about, like I said, we're kind of introducing some new things here as far as new terminology, communities and biomes and ecosystems. If you remember, we kind of talked about populations and individuals a little bit last week, so we're just kind of working our way up in scale here. And something I want to start off here is just kind of introducing this idea that no species exists in a vacuum. And what I mean by that is like, we talked about species and how they interact with their environment, but they're not the only ones there. There's almost any given location, if there's one species there, there's probably going to be multiple species there. And so even they may not interact directly, even though oftentimes they do. Even if they don't, there's still indirect implications that could have. So we're kind of getting into this idea that species are having influences on each other now, as well as interacting with their environment. So I do want to take some time to introduce some of these definitions. There's a number of them. We're introducing some new terminology and things like, ecological communities and ecosystems and biomes. It's sort of like in the popular media or the popular world, they tend to be used kind of interchangeably. So I want to take some time to walk through these definitions because they actually, in the scientific world, have very specific and different meanings. So a community is all the species that occur and interact in the same place. So you can kind of, excuse me, you kind of think of a community as a group of species that all occur and interact in the same location. So if you go to a location and just um, figured out all the species that were present there, that would be the community. It's not necessarily anything to do with the environment. It's just the biotic group of species that exists there. And there's actually this debate about how do I want to say this, like the way in which communities are organized and how they change over time and the way we think of them. So there's this camp that thinks of communities as sort of this superorganism where each species is sort of dependent on what another species is doing and maybe whether a certain species is there or not. So there's sort of like, if you think of a body with its organs that all work together to create the life of that organism. A community would be the same thing where you have these different populations of different species that are interdependent on one another, and the functioning of the community is sort of revolved around how those specific organisms interact and whether they exist there or not. Another school of thought is that these things are completely independent from one another. Like they may exist in the same location, but that's just kind of um, a function of some other things, not necessarily how they're interacting with each other. And these are two kind of opposing ideas, and like any good scientific debate, there's evidence to support both of these ideas. Otherwise, it wouldn't be a debate, really. And so we'll get into a little bit more about this. Another way to think about this sort of thing is sort of how we approach what a community is and how we define a community. So there's different ways to do it. You can measure the biodiversity, like you can say how many different types of species are there, and different things related to that. You can say what are the specific species that are there, and is that different from another community? Or you can sort of like take this accumulated, like how much living material is there. These are sort of characteristics of the community that you could measure and use to describe it in some way. Um, Another approach you might take is that you could say, what are the functions that occur in this community? What are the processes? So, like, how does energy flow throughout this community? Nutrient cycling, how does that occur? What's the specific, how is, nitrogen and phosphorus and stuff flowing through and carbon flowing through the system, photosynthesis and things like decomposition. So you could look at processes instead of necessarily characteristics, and you could quantify those and use that to describe the community as well. So there's different sort of approaches to how we think of communities. And if we zoom out, we're kind of like, usually if you zoom out, and I'll get to this in a second, if you zoom out far enough, you go to the biome level. But sort of in between the community and the biome level is this thing called meta communities, where it's like meta community is sort of a group of communities that are usually somewhat similar and connected in some way, but not necessarily overlapping in terms of, it's not like you would call this, one congruent community. It's more like a grouping of them, and different from a biome in the sense that it's not quite at the same scale. I'll talk about a biome here in a second. Not quite at the same scale, but these are usually connected, similar types of communities, sort of fragmented communities might be another way to think of it. Okay, so a biome, if you zoom out, a biome is all of the communities that occur together at the landscape scale. So you're not quite at like the global scale, but maybe at like the continental or regional scale, somewhere in there. If you're grouping all the communities together, if a community is a group of populations, then a biome is a group of communities. So you're just kind of working your way up and aggregating at different scales there. Here's sort of an example of that. So again, a biome is all the communities that occur together at the landscape level. Here we're looking at what is unofficially known as the spruce moose biome, which at northern latitudes you get these groupings that all tend to occur together, not just in North America, but in other areas around the world too, at certain latitudes and at certain elevations. That's something to remember, the pattern between elevation and latitude. As you go up in latitude, even if you're at if you go up in elevation, even if you're at lower latitudes, um, you tend to get environments that are similar to northern latitudes. Anyway, so what you have here is like, there's a population of spruce tree species that occur up here, and you can see those range, that general range for those species. And you have some kinglets that occur together, and some red-backed voles that occur together, and there's moose populations as well. And also, these are not the only species that occur up here, but just showing the overlap in those geographic ranges. Taking that together creates what's called the spruce moose biome, or like the boreal forest biome is probably the more scientific terminology for that. Um, Sort of taking a different view here. So that was sort of communities and biomes. Ecosystem is a little bit of a different sort of thing. It can occur, an ecosystem can be at a lot of different scales. So it's sort of scale independent. But if we were to define it, an ecosystem is all of the biotic and abiotic features of an environment. So you're going to have, if you have organisms in a place, how are they interacting with each other, with members of different species, with members of their own species, and then how are they interacting with the environment, and what is what's the temperature, and what's the precipitation, and what's the topography, and is it terrestrial or aquatic or whatever it is. All of those features together, both the biotic and the abiotic, are going to be part of the ecosystem, and that could exist. It doesn't matter necessarily what scale you're looking at that. It's sort of about what's going on in terms of the abiotic biotic and abiotic environment. Okay, I'm going to finish up this first video. Keep working your way through the module. There's a reading about, it sort of highlights this idea about why it's kind of hard to define what an ecosystem is in particular in reference to a forest ecosystem. So keep working your way through that. There'll be a discussion, and I will see you in the next video.